Mr. President, this Saturday marks 1 year since the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade at the urging of extremist politicians, upending 50 years of precedent protecting women's right to health care. In the year since that decision, half the states in our country have banned or effectively banned access to abortion. Women in those states have extremely limited options for getting the health care they need. Those who can't afford to travel have no choice but to go to other states to receive critical reproductive care. That's what happened to Lauren Hall. She and her husband were excited that she was pregnant for the first time, but then she learned that her fetus was developing without a skull, a condition that meant it wouldn't survive. This condition also increased Lauren's risk of hemorrhaging. Her doctors at home in Texas refused to help her terminate the pregnancy, so she had to travel to Seattle, where she was finally able to get the abortion care that she needed. She's currently suing the state of Texas for refusing to give her potentially life-saving medical care. Now, we knew that after the Dobbs decision, stories like Lauren's would only happen more often, and millions of women would lose the health care they need. Even before Roe fell, healthcare organizations in Nevada were prepared for an influx of women from out of state who needed abortion services. Justice Brett Kavanaugh recognized this too. In his concurring opinion, he indicated that women who have to leave their home state to get the care they need would be protected by the constitutional right to interstate travel. But we could see from miles away in Nevada that the far right would never stop plotting to roll back women's rights even further. In the last year alone, we've seen extremist Republicans try to stop women in our military from getting the health care they need. They've come after safe and effective birth control, and they've even supported a federal abortion ban to outlaw reproductive care in all 50 states. And now we're seeing far-right extremists actively work to bar women from seeking care in states outside their own. Now, let's be clear, this is about controlling women. The far right doesn't trust women to make their own health care decisions, so they think those decisions should be made by politicians instead. Well, I don't know about some of my colleagues across the aisle, but I don't think elected officials should be telling women what to do with their bodies. And neither do the vast majority of Nevadans. We are a proud pro-choice state. Back in 1990, Nevadans overwhelmingly voted to codify a woman's right to choose. And today, over 2/3 of Nevadans believe that a woman's health care decisions are between her and her doctor. And that's across all parties, Democrats, Republicans, and independents. But even though Nevada is a safe place for women who need health care, far-right Republicans living outside my state are telling women, oh, no, sorry, we're making it illegal for you to go there. This April, Idaho became the first state to make it a criminal offense for someone to help an individual travel out of state to seek an abortion. And elected officials in states like Tennessee, Texas, and Missouri are trying to punish women for leaving their state for reproductive care, as well as anyone who helps them, including their doctors or even their employers. This is why my colleagues and I are reintroducing the Freedom to Travel for Health Care Act. 1 year after Roe versus Wade was overturned, we need this bill more than ever. Our legislation reaffirms that women have a fundamental right to interstate travel and makes crystal clear that states cannot prosecute women or anyone who helps them for going to another state to get the critical reproductive care that they need. We're talking about upholding a constitutional right to allow women to travel outside their home state. Now, why do some of my anti-choice colleagues want to restrict women from moving freely between states? The answer is simple. They don't trust women to have control over their own bodies. Well, I do. And I'm going to keep doing everything in my power to protect women, not just in Nevada, but in every state across the country. We must pass the Freedom to Travel for Health Care Act. So, Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-2053 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, the bill be considered read a third time and passed and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, there is an obsession on the left with abortion. It's becoming all-encompassing, infecting conversations that we have in the Senate on everything from the military to the Department of Veterans Affairs to phantom state laws that don't even exist. Look, judges have to bow their policy objectives if they want to be appointed in this administration, or those who are already on the bench, if they don't bow their policy objectives, if they don't bow to the abortion-centric, abortion-obsessed culture on the left, then all of a sudden they're going to face these baseless attacks to their credibility and even threats of violence. Now, this bill, properly understood, really should be called the Freedom to Traffic Act. You see, to my knowledge, no state, not a single state, has enacted a law restricting an adult's right to travel across state lines for purposes of an abortion or otherwise. I'm not even aware of a single state considering such a thing. And if a state were to even consider it, they wouldn't do it. And if they did do it, such a law would undoubtedly be struck down as unconstitutional on one of at least several grounds, including the fact that the Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution has been interpreted by the Supreme Court, among other things, to prohibit any state from treating an article of commerce, including a good, a person, or thing, in interstate commerce differently based on its origin or destination out of state or outside the United States. States can't cabin their own residents or anyone inside their own state boundaries. That's well understood. So they don't have that authority. But more importantly, we're dealing with a phantom problem, a phantom law that does not exist. There's not a single state law out there that restricts an adult's right to travel out of state for an abortion or otherwise. Now, what some states do have, and perhaps that's what's causing the confusion here, are some laws to stop the trafficking of children across state lines to obtain an abortion without notifying their parents. Now, this is well established. We have laws on the books prohibiting the trafficking of minors across state lines with good reason. This is very different than what was implied as a reason why we need to pass this bill here today, and it just isn't true. Those laws don't exist. They are not on the books. They're not even being considered to be placed on the books. These laws are aimed to stop the sexual abuse of children by prohibiting their adult abusers and those in the abortion industry to help facilitate that abuse by transporting them across state lines for the purpose of obtaining an abortion and thus hiding the fact that they got an abortion from their parents. There are good reasons for these laws, Mr. President. In 2004, for example, the 14-year-old daughter of Marcia Carroll was taken by her boyfriend's family from their home in Pennsylvania, where they lived, to New Jersey. New Jersey, where parental consent for an abortion was not required at the time. There, once in New Jersey, they threatened to leave her in New Jersey unless she got an abortion, which she did, under duress, under coercion, afraid. The grief and devastation crushed this 14-year-old girl and her family, who had agreed to keep the baby. This so-called Freedom to Traffic Act would hamper the ability of states to punish such criminal and cowardly actions. I don't think there's anyone here who can defend that. Trafficking a child across state lines for purposes of obtaining an abortion. Now, sadly, this is not an isolated incident. Far from it. We know from undercover videos, from testimony from other courageous victims, and reports from former employees that Planned Parenthood actively works to hide these child sexual abuse instances, covering up for adult abusers by providing their child victims with abortions and failing to report abuse. This, again, is another thing that happens. Not only do we distort the facts, not only do we distort the status quo of the law in this country, but we also distort key facts when people become obsessed with abortion and they see abortion as if it were somehow an unmitigated good. Look, this bill was just barely introduced in the Senate, I believe as recently as yesterday. This bill has not been through any committee. It's not been marked up in the Committee of Jurisdiction, the Senate Judiciary Committee on which I serve. But Democrats think we should just pass it anyway. And I guess maybe they're channeling the now infamous words of former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi when she said, we have to pass the bill so that you can find out what's in it. This isn't how we legislate. We certainly shouldn't be legislating when we haven't reviewed the bill, hasn't been through committee, we don't know what it says, and the bill's proponents are badly mischaracterizing what it does and why we need it. On that basis, I object.
Senator from Nevada.
Well, as we've already pointed out, the Constitution does protect the right to travel in this country, and there's no doubt that Supreme Court has made that precedent clear. But constitutional rights don't enforce themselves, and my colleagues on the far right only cloak themselves in the Constitution when it suits them, and right now it really doesn't suit them. That's why far-right Republicans in state legislatures across the country are working on and passing laws specifically focused on restricting a woman's right to travel for reproductive health care, something I noticed my colleague from Utah seemed to ignore, that Tennessee, Texas, Missouri, or some of those states. And at the end of the day, let me just touch on this idea that somehow this legislation is focusing on trafficking of individuals for sexual exploitation. Now, again, this is a perfect example of some of the far-right Republicans, when they really can't argue the facts and the law of something, then they just make things up. Or they throw inflammatory arguments out there to try to scare individuals. But let me just make this clear. As a former Attorney General who works and continues to work on human trafficking issues that address the sexual exploitation of adults and minors, this is not trafficking. And I would say to my colleague in Utah, who knows better, that sexual exploitation of individuals that this country needs to address, as long as many other countries, and we've passed laws to protect individuals, this is not it. What I do know is instead of addressing the true issue before us, which is, why can't women be free to travel from a state that has restricted their right to abortion to my state, where we have chosen to allow them to get the health care they need, the essential health care. Now, it's always fascinating to me that I hear on the far right my colleagues say, it's always about states' rights. It's about states' rights. This is a states' rights issue. Dobbs basically said in its decision, this is a states' rights issue. But then when it doesn't suit what they care about, the far right say, well, forget those states' rights. Only listen to what we as elected officials determine you should have. Ignore what Nevada has done. Ignore the Democrats, the Republicans, the independents, the men and the women in Nevada who chose to codify the right of a woman to choose and seek essential health care, and ignore that completely. That's what this legislation is about. It is about trusting women and giving them the ability to come to a state like Nevada to seek essential health care for their reproductive rights. And again, I constantly hear this emotional arguments about, and my colleague from Utah, who I respect, but he said this, the left somehow has an obsession with abortion. This is outrageous. Outrageous inflammatory talk. What we do have an obsession with is freedom. And that every American in this country, whether you are a man or a woman, should have that freedom. And it shouldn't be taken away from you by elected officials who think they know better about your health care than you do, who think that they can restrict in their state your access to health care that could jeopardize your health care and your decisions about your family and your future because they think they know better. Mr. President, I just think it is outrageous that one simple thing that we cannot agree to in this Congress in a bipartisan way is that women should have that fundamental freedom to travel for their health care needs without being restricted, without being called names, without being fearful, and we should be protecting those doctors and the health care decisions to do it. I will say one final thing. We have worked hard in this country to evolve so that all our medical care is some of the best. We are fighting right now to make sure that we have access to technology, we have access to medical care, we do the research, we do the development. We have the medical care of the 21st century. And what my far-right Republicans are telling women across this country is you can't access that medical care for the 21st century. You know why? Because we think that we should hold you back to the 19th century. We want to politicize this and we want to take away your rights. And so we are going to take you back to the 19th century. It is outrageous. Outrageous that we have to be here at this day and age. Over 50 years of Roe versus Wade, not one issue that we can see impeded anybody's rights here for women across this country and this fundamental freedom about reproductive rights. And so I am disappointed, but I will tell you what, Mr. President, this is an issue you are going to see all of us, one after another, continue to fight. This is an essential fight for women in this country and their rights and their freedom to choose. The freedom to choose and not have somebody else dictate what they should or shouldn't do with their bodies. Not to have somebody else dictate based on whatever their religion is or their rights, that they know better than somebody living in an issue that is so personal to them that they can be dictated to in this day and age. I yield the floor.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, it's important to point out that this legislation makes no distinction between those covered by it, whether they're children or adults. And that's my whole point, is that one of the problems with this is that it would block the effectiveness of state statutes that are there to protect children against interstate trafficking for the purpose of getting them abortions in another state without the knowledge or consent of their parents. And that's an issue. And yes, I do maintain I'm not aware of a single state law that prohibits a woman from traveling out of state, an adult woman from traveling out of state. If such a law exists, I'm not aware of it, and if it exists, despite my non-awareness of it, it's unenforceable. It would be deemed invalid instantaneously. You can't do that. But what this would do, since it makes no distinction between children and adults, is it would halt the operation of these state laws designed to protect children from interstate trafficking for the purpose of obtaining abortion, which is very often necessary in order to conceal child sex perpetrators and child traffickers in what they're doing. Now, my colleague and friend from Nevada, the distinguished senator from Nevada, referred to this, kept characterizing the far right. Now, to my knowledge, nearly every Republican in this chamber is pro-life. There's a few variations along the way, but nearly all of us are pro-life. Call all of us far right is excessive, and it's unfair. It's unfair especially because there's a mischaracterization also of why we believe what we believe. At least I can tell you what I believe about this. She refers to states' rights. I'd never call it that. Why? Well, because states don't have rights. States have authority. Authority is sort of the inverse polar opposite of a right. A right is something that you have that protects you from action by the state, by the government. Protects you from the authority of the collective coercive force that is government. So these aren't state rights, this is state authority. And that's really how we arrived here. That's really where we've been for the last half century. And while people are on the left bemoaning the deprivation of a right, I challenge each of them to tell me where in the Constitution it talks about abortion. And even though, of course, the word abortion doesn't appear in the Constitution, but what part of the Constitution actually confers that right? That's the problem that we're getting at here, and that's what I would like to address here for a moment. You see, because in Washington, it sometimes starts to feel like we're up against an immovable object, and where progress is measured in inches, and then victories are sparse and hard-fought, then occasionally the tides turn and something significant happens, and there's a seismic shift. 1 year ago, we experienced such a seismic shift when the Supreme Court issued its landmark decision in the case of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health. But to fully appreciate the significance of that historic moment and that decision, we must first understand the journey that got us to this point in the first place. So let's rewind the clock 50 years, all the way back to 1973, when the Supreme Court handed down its ruling in Roe versus Wade. A decision that, to say that it legalized abortion doesn't really capture the image. It centralized power in Washington, D.C. over abortion policy decisions. And then it kept that power not in the legislative branch of the federal government based in Washington, D.C., but across the street at the Supreme Court in 9 lawyers wearing black robes who have been sworn in as justices. By removing the American people's ability to make decisions through their duly elected lawmakers regarding abortion. It was a moment that completely reshaped the American people's ability to impact abortion policy. So for nearly 5 decades after that decision, this power to determine abortion policy rested ultimately with the Supreme Court. Sure, the Supreme Court would leave enough wiggle room to leave the impression that lawmakers, primarily at the state level, of course, could make law. But the Supreme Court was constantly inventing and reinventing what the standard was and what was not a permissible restriction on abortion. You see, this is what happens when you make up a non-existent constitutional right. When you just decide that something's really important, that you feel so strongly about it, that it must be in there. It's got to be in the Constitution because it's so important. When you take it away from the constitutional text, from the words of the document, all of a sudden you're left in this sort of no man's land where you have to make things up as you go along. The result was chaos. 49 and a half years of chaotic manipulation at will of the law. A state would do one thing, the Supreme Court would strike it down. Another state would do something slightly different, the Supreme Court would uphold it, sometimes changing standards along the way. But in Dobbs, the Supreme Court recognized the constitutional importance of keeping the power with the people, affirming that they have a legitimate interest in protecting the lives of the unborn, and that they possess the authority to enact laws that reflect their values. You see, remember a moment ago when we talked about the difference between authority and rights. They're the opposite of each other. Rights protect you from authority. So when the Supreme Court decided as a matter of policy that it was so passionate about abortion in 1973 that it had to be in the Constitution, they effectively wrote it into the Constitution, even though it's not there, They made it utterly impossible for the people's elected representatives, either in their state legislative bodies, entities of local government, or where appropriate in Congress, to make most of the laws. Ultimately, those were all subject to the will and the whim and the caprice of the Supreme Court. They did that because they deemed it part of the Constitution. But when you just deem something a part of the Constitution, it doesn't make it part of the Constitution. I believe it was Abraham Lincoln who once asked rhetorically the question, if you call the tail of a dog a leg, how many legs does the dog have? He asked the question, someone answered 5, and he said, no, wrong, it's still 4. Just because you call the tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. The dog still has 4 legs. This still is the Constitution. There still is nothing in here that says, by the way, the people can't make laws to protect the lives of the unborn unless the Supreme Court decides that they are permissible based on its own meandering standards, utterly untethered from the text of the Constitution or from 400 years of Anglo-American legal and jurisprudential tradition. So in Dobbs, they restored this power back to the people. In Dobbs, they reaffirmed the fundamental belief that every human life is sacred and every human life is deserving of protection. In Dobbs, the court recognized that decisions on deeply personal and morally significant matters should be made closest to the people that they affect. Unfortunately, in the wake of Roe, we've witnessed a really dark chapter in our nation's history. This decision wrongly declared that abortion was a right, despite no mention of it anywhere in the Constitution. The decision ushered in a new era, one that forced us to tolerate some of the most barbaric of practices. Late-term abortions, gruesome procedures that practically no American supports, became a stain on our society. Even as those cases were litigated, the gruesome procedures were described. Some of the most hardened lawyers could barely tolerate mentioning much or even listening to the words describing the procedures. But
President, would the senator yield for a question about how long he intends to speak, just for the convenience of others?
Sure. I anticipate I'll be finished within 5 minutes.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
But we refused to accept this as the new status quo. We knew that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. The Dobbs decision brought us a glimmer of hope. It reaffirmed the fundamental belief that every human life really is sacred and is deserving of protection and is capable of being protected within our constitutional system. Finally, we are empowered to exercise our constitutional prerogative and resume our efforts to protect the lives of the unborn and end these unspeakable horrors. And so, this issue of states' rights, again, they're not states' rights. That's oxymoronic. We call it federalism, state authority. So this victory of Dobbs, it's not just a victory for state sovereign authority. It's also a victory for humanity. Because when we're told by the judicial branch of government, contrary to fact, that the Constitution tells us that we cannot, may not, must not protect unborn human life, that really does grave damage to humanity. The victory of Dobbs is a reminder that we can't afford to turn a blind eye to the moral and ethical implications of our laws. We must proceed in a way that protects the innocent and defend against the atrocities allowed under this lofty-sounding but ultimately barbaric platitude of choice. Even with this victory, we still have a long way to go. Contrary to the assertions of many on the Democratic side of the aisle, the Dobbs decision did not make abortion illegal. It did nothing of the sort. While many states have passed laws to protect preborn children, and I applaud them for doing so, others have expanded their abortion laws. Late-term and partial birth abortions are still a reality in many states. This isn't something that I celebrate. I disagree with those laws. But I don't live in those states. And the important thing is that the people in those states are making those laws. And most of the time it is in the states and not here in Congress, where things not rendered federal by the Constitution should be decided. As we approach the one-year anniversary of Dobbs, I believe we're duty-bound to remember the millions upon millions of innocent lives lost, the pain and suffering endured, and the resilience of the men and women who fought for those who could not fight for themselves, who have no voice and therefore had to have others speak on their behalf. We should be inspired to build a society where every life is cherished, where compassion triumphs over convenience and cowardice, and where the horrors of abortion become a distant memory, especially the horrors of abortion forced upon us by a judicial oligarchy utterly untethered from the text of the Constitution. The Dobbs decision represented a turning point, the moment when we said enough is enough. Now we're positioned to acknowledge that every life, from conception to natural birth, deserves our protection and our compassion and our care. And yes, in some states they're going to do that differently than in others. But the fact that they're going to do it differently in one state or another doesn't mean that they don't deserve protection. So as we celebrate this milestone, I hope we can remain committed to this cause. Let us never forget the horrors foisted upon us by Roe and the significance of the Dobbs decision in restoring sanity and compassion to the laws that guide our nation. Together we can forge our future, where the rights of the unborn are safeguarded, where the dignity of every human being is cherished, and where the dark days of the past remain only as reminders of our resolve to create a better world. In the face of adversity, remember that change is possible. Remember that we possess the ability to achieve great things. Our nation's health and strength lie in the people's hands, and together we can shape a future where every life is valued.